She didn't walk into that studio as a guest. She walked in as a peer. And the three men sitting next to her have the rings, the scoring titles, and the Hall of Fame plaques to prove exactly what that means. Sunday, March 29th. NBC's Basketball Night in America. Caitlin Clark, seated at the same table as Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, and Tracy McGrady, breaking down NBA basketball on national primetime television in front of an audience that didn't need to know anything about the WNBA to understand that something significant was happening right in front of them. No warm-up segment. No courtesy cameo tucked between commercial breaks. A full panel seat. Equal footing. The real thing. But here's what makes this week genuinely different from every other Caitlin Clark headline cycle you've sat through over the last 2 years. That NBC moment didn't arrive alone. While Clark was preparing to step into one of the most visible broadcast positions any women's basketball player has ever occupied, the Indiana Fever's front office was running numbers behind closed doors. Quiet numbers. The kind of roster math that front offices never announce until they absolutely have to, because the announcement itself cost them something. And in this particular calculation, the number that keeps coming up belongs to a player Indiana fans adopted long before they fully understood why they needed her. Sophie Cunningham. The enforcer. The protector. The player who looked at the most scrutinized rookie in professional basketball and decided, without hesitation, that her job was to make sure nobody put their hands on her twice. Both stories. Full breakdown. No manufactured drama, no clickbait arithmetic dressed up as analysis. The real version of both. But before any of that, the foundation has to be laid correctly. Because neither of these stories makes complete sense without understanding what Caitlin Clark was walking into when she entered the league, what she represented beyond the stat lines and highlight packages, and why every single move her organization makes around her carries weight that extends far outside the borders of Indiana. Cast your mind back to the spring of 2024. The build-up to Clark's WNBA draft entry wasn't hype in the traditional sports sense. It was something closer to cultural pressure. The kind that doesn't come from ESPN segments and Twitter threads alone but from people who had never purchased a WNBA ticket in their lives suddenly caring intensely about where this specific player landed, how she was treated, whether the league infrastructure around her was built to let her succeed or positioned to quietly absorb her without adjustment. The Indiana Fever selected her first overall and immediately inherited that pressure wholesale. Everything that franchise did from that moment forward was going to be examined. Every roster decision, every coaching call, every free agency signing would be filtered through one central question. Are they building the right environment for the player who just transformed your attendance numbers, your television ratings, and your cultural relevance in a single season? That question sounds like praise. In organizational terms, it functions like a weight. Clark herself handled it the way she handles most things. She played through it. She processed the physical punishment that came her way in year one, the hits that drew national attention and genuine outrage, the moments where the league's response to how she was being treated felt insufficient to a fanbase that was watching every possession with a level of emotional investment the WNBA hadn't previously generated at scale. She processed all of it, she came back stronger, and by the time her second season arrived, the conversation had shifted from whether she could survive the league to whether the league could keep pace with what she was building. That's not hyperbole. That's the documented ratings trajectory. That's the sponsorship movement. That's what NBC saw when they made the call that landed her on that panel. They weren't doing the WNBA a favor. They were making a business decision. And the business decision pointed directly at Clark. Understanding that context is what makes the Sophie Cunningham situation land the way it should. Because the Fever didn't just acquire Cunningham to fill a roster spot. They acquired her because of who she was willing to be for the player they built their entire future around. And now, the expansion draft math is threatening to take that away. The numbers don't care about loyalty. They rarely do. Let's talk about what Sophie Cunningham actually is, because the highlight packages don't fully capture it and the stat sheet was never the point. There are players in professional basketball who exist primarily as producers. Their value is measurable, quantifiable, expressible in columns and percentages that front offices can compare side by side against the rest of the league. Points per game, shooting splits, defensive rating, assist-to-turnover ratio. Those players are easy to evaluate and, consequently, easy to replace when the roster math demands it. Then there are players whose value lives in a category that doesn't have a column. Sophie Cunningham is the second kind. What she brought to Indiana in 2024 wasn't primarily about her three-point percentage, though that was real and that was useful. It was about something that franchises building around generational talents understand intuitively but rarely discuss publicly, because discussing it publicly requires acknowledging that professional sports, even at the highest level, contains elements that the rulebook alone cannot regulate. Protection. Presence. The credible, demonstrated willingness to insert yourself physically into situations that most players on your roster would calculate their way out of. When Caitlin Clark was absorbing contact in her rookie season, the responses varied across the Indiana roster. Some players reacted verbally. Some reacted with body language. Cunningham reacted with her body. She stepped in. She got in faces. She communicated, without ambiguity, that there was a cost attached to how her teammate was being treated. And that communication was received. You could see it being received in real time if you were watching closely enough. That kind of player does something to a locker room that no analytics package currently measures. She changes the internal temperature of a team. She tells the player she's protecting something that coaches can say 1,000 times in a film room, but that lands differently when it comes from someone who just proved it on the floor in front of 20,000 people. You are not alone out here. I see what's happening to you, and I am not going to let it continue without a response. For Clark, coming into a league where the physical adjustment period was documented publicly and debated nationally, having that presence on the floor next to her wasn't a luxury. It was load-bearing. Indiana's front office understood that. The fan base understood it faster than almost anyone, which is why Cunningham's popularity in Indiana climbed at a rate that had very little to do with her traditional production numbers and everything to do with what people watched her do and who they watched her do it for. She became Clark's person. And in professional sports, when a player becomes that for a franchise cornerstone, the relationship takes on a meaning that exceeds basketball. Which is precisely why what's coming out of the expansion draft calculation is so difficult for Indiana's fanbase to process. Here's the structural reality, explained plainly, because most of the content circulating around this topic has been either deliberately vague or technically inaccurate in ways that generate more anxiety than the actual situation warrants. The WNBA is expanding. The Golden State Valkyries are entering the league, and with that expansion comes an expansion draft. The mechanics of that draft require existing franchises to expose a portion of their roster to potential selection. Every team is permitted to protect a specific number of players. The players left unprotected become available. The expansion franchise selects from that available pool. Indiana's protection decisions are where this gets complicated. The Fever have core pieces they cannot afford to leave unprotected. Clark is untouchable, that's not even a conversation. Aaliyah Boston, the foundational interior presence who has been the team's most consistent two-way player since before Clark arrived, is not getting left exposed. The young pieces the organization has invested development capital in, the players whose upside is attached to Indiana's medium and long-term competitive window, those players carry protection priority too. When you work through the list methodically and honestly, the uncomfortable math begins to emerge. Cunningham's position on the protected list is not secure. It may not even be close to secure. And the people running Indiana's front office are not running it carelessly. They are making a deliberate calculation about what this roster needs to look like moving forward, which means the Cunningham situation isn't an oversight or an accident. It's a choice. A painful one. But a choice. That distinction matters enormously, and it's the part most channels have either glossed over or completely missed. Before the expansion draft math gets dismantled completely, the NBC story deserves its full treatment. Because the two narratives are connected in a way that isn't immediately obvious but becomes impossible to ignore once you see it. The same week Indiana was quietly working through roster decisions that could fundamentally alter the protective structure around their franchise player, that franchise player was sitting on national primetime television next to three of the most decorated offensive talents professional basketball has ever produced. And she wasn't there to be introduced. She wasn't there to be explained to an audience unfamiliar with her name. She was there to work. That separation is critical. NBC's Basketball Night in America has been a fixture of the American sports broadcast landscape for decades. The people who make decisions about that panel are not making them based on sentiment or cultural goodwill. They are making them based on a single relentless calculation. Who keeps people watching? Who generates the kind of credibility and engagement that justifies the real estate of a national primetime slot in front of an audience that is comparison shopping against every other entertainment option available to them on a Sunday night? The competition for that attention is not abstract. It is enormous and it is unforgiving. NBC chose Clark anyway. Not despite that competitive pressure. Because of it. Carmelo Anthony spent 20 years in this league accumulating a scoring resume that places him among a group of players so small you can count them on one hand. His offensive vocabulary, the post-game, the mid-range fluency, The ability to manufacture points from positions where other players couldn't even catch the ball cleanly, that's the product of a career built at the absolute apex of professional basketball. His presence on that panel carries a specific weight that comes from having done it at the highest level for the longest time. Vince Carter redefined the physical ceiling of what a human being could do above the rim at a moment when the entire basketball world was watching. The 2000 slam dunk contest alone secured him a permanent place in the sport's cultural memory. 22 seasons in the league after that. A career that outlasted franchises, coaching staffs, and entire eras of the game. When Carter speaks about basketball, he speaks with the authority of someone who watched the sport transform around him across multiple generations of players. Tracy McGrady's case is one of the most genuinely complicated in the history of professional basketball. A scorer whose physical gifts were so complete, so naturally assembled, that serious basketball minds still debate what his ceiling could have reached in a different injury timeline. 2 scoring titles. Footage that coaches still pull out specifically because his footwork and shot creation process remains instructional at the professional level decades removed from his prime. The kind of player who makes other players uncomfortable not through physicality but through the sheer effortlessness of what he could do with a basketball. Those 3 men. That panel. Ann Clark in the 4th seat, not filling space, not representing a demographic, not serving as a symbolic gesture toward inclusivity that the network could point to in a press release. Analyzing. Contributing. Holding her position in the conversation. The reaction from the basketball world wasn't uniformly celebratory, which tells you something important. There is a portion of the audience that encountered Clark on that panel and experienced something closer to friction than enthusiasm. The argument, expressed with varying degrees of directness depending on the platform, was that her presence in that seat came at the expense of someone with deeper NBA credentials. That the selection was driven by marketability rather than pure basketball knowledge. That the network was making a cultural statement rather than a sporting one. That argument deserves engagement rather than dismissal, because dismissing it without examination is exactly the kind of intellectual laziness that produces bad analysis. Here's the honest response to it. NBC is not a nonprofit. It is not a cultural institution operating outside the pressures of audience measurement and advertising revenue. It is a business making decisions that are accountable to ratings in a media environment that has never been more competitive or more fragmented. If Clark's presence on that panel were a net negative for their broadcast, if audiences changed the channel when she appeared, if the segment underperformed relative to what a different panelist would have generated, NBC would know within hours and they would adjust accordingly. They have not adjusted. They brought her back. The market gave its answer. It gave it clearly. There is a version of Caitlin Clark's rise that gets told as a simple story. Small-town Iowa girl, historic college career, generational scorer, drafted first overall, changes the league overnight. Clean arc satisfying narrative. Easy to package into a 3-minute highlight reel with the right music underneath it. That version is not wrong. It's just incomplete. The real version has friction in it. The real version has moments that don't fit neatly into the inspirational template. And understanding those moments is what separates genuine analysis from content that's just riding the wave of her popularity without adding anything to the conversation. When Clark entered the WNBA, the expectation management from the outside was essentially non-existent. The college numbers were so historically singular, the cultural momentum so overwhelming, that a significant portion of the audience arriving at WNBA games for the first time had no functional framework for what professional adjustment actually looks like. They had watched her dismantle Big Ten defenses for 4 years. They arrived expecting continuity. Professional basketball doesn't work that way. It has never worked that way for anyone. The physical reality of the WNBA presents a specific challenge that college success, regardless of its scale, does not fully prepare any player to handle immediately. The athletes are stronger. The defensive schemes are more sophisticated and more consistently executed. The margin for the kind of off-balance, heavily contested attempts that Clark converted throughout her college career compresses dramatically at the professional level. None of that is an indictment of her ability. It is simply the standard cost of entry that every player pays when the competition level elevates. What made Clark's adjustment period different wasn't the adjustment itself. It was the audience watching it happen. Millions of people who had never attended a WNBA game, never streamed a WNBA broadcast, never engaged with the league in any meaningful way were suddenly watching every possession she played with the kind of granular attention that professional athletes spend entire careers trying not to have directed at them during the learning phase of their development. Every turnover was documented. Every inefficient shooting stretch was analyzed. Every physical confrontation was filmed, uploaded, and debated across platforms that had never previously hosted sustained conversations about women's basketball. That pressure doesn't break everyone, but it breaks most people. Clark processed it and played through it, which is itself a data point worth examining carefully. Because the players who survive that level of early career scrutiny without losing their competitive identity are not common. The ones who come out the other side with their confidence intact and their game expanding rather than contracting represent a specific category of competitor that professional franchises build long-term plans around. Indiana watched that process happen in real time and made their calculations accordingly. The front office additions they pursued heading into year 2 weren't accidental. The emphasis on building physical protection and competitive toughness around Clark reflected an organizational acknowledgement that what happened in year 1 could not be the operating condition for the franchise going forward. They needed the environment around their cornerstone player to change. They went and changed it. Cunningham was the most visible expression of that organizational intention. But here's the layer of this story that makes the expansion draft situation genuinely painful rather than just administratively inconvenient. The Fever didn't build their protective structure around Clark as a temporary measure. They built it as a foundation. The implicit promise in those roster decisions was continuity. The message to Clark, delivered through personnel choices rather than press conferences, was that the organization understood what she needed and was committed to providing it. The expansion draft is now testing whether that commitment can survive contact with financial and structural reality. Because protection on a roster isn't free. It costs a protection slot. And protection slots are finite. Every player Indiana shields from Golden State's selection is a player some other franchise cannot take. Every player left exposed is a calculated risk that the front office is accepting on behalf of the entire organization. The question Indiana is currently answering, whether they have announced it publicly or not, is this. In a world where we cannot protect everyone, what does protecting Caitlin Clark's environment actually require? And is Sophie Cunningham, specifically, an irreplaceable component of that environment? Or is she a component that the roster can functionally replace through other means? That question sounds cold when you strip away the emotional context. Inside a front office it's just Tuesday. Let's put real numbers against this situation, because the emotional conversation around the expansion draft has been running significantly ahead of the structural conversation. And that gap is where confusion takes root. The WNBA expansion draft operates under a protection framework that every existing franchise navigates simultaneously. Indiana is not making these decisions in isolation. Every team in the league is working through identical pressure right now, identifying their untouchable players, ranking the rest, and making peace with the reality that someone they valued is going to become available. That's the design of the system. It is intentional and it is unavoidable. Indiana's core is not difficult to identify at the top. Clark is protected. That conversation begins and ends in the same breath. She is the most valuable individual asset in the history of this franchise and arguably one of the most valuable in the current landscape of women's professional basketball globally. No version of this calculation leaves her exposed. That slot is allocated before the front office opens the first spreadsheet. Aaliyah Boston represents the second layer of that untouchable tier. Boston's value to this roster extends beyond her individual production, substantial as that production is. She is the interior anchor around which Indiana's defensive structure is built. She is the veteran presence in a locker room that is still developing its professional identity. She is the player whose development arc was already well established before Clark arrived, which means her ceiling and her reliability are quantities Indiana can project with confidence. She is protected. From there, the decisions become genuinely difficult. Kelsey Mitchell's offensive creation ability off the bounce gives Indiana a dimension that doesn't duplicate easily in free agency. Nalissa Smith's development trajectory represents invested organizational capital that the front office has legitimate reason to shield. The younger pieces on the roster, the players whose upside is still expanding, carry protection consideration because their replacement cost in the current market is non-trivial. Work through that list honestly and the protected slots fill faster than the fan base's emotional accounting has been prepared for. Cunningham lands in a complicated position not because Indiana doesn't value what she provides but because what she provides, as remarkable and as real as it is, occupies a category that the protection framework doesn't weigh the same way it weighs statistical production and positional scarcity. Her value is contextual. It is relational. It is tied specifically to what she means for Clark's experience of this league and this team. Those are not categories that show up in the expansion draft rulebook. Golden State's front office, assembling a roster from scratch with the specific mandate of building something competitive as quickly as possible, is looking at exposed players through an entirely different lens. They are looking for the most immediately useful pieces available. Players with professional experience, established skill sets, and the competitive temperament to contribute to a new organization without a prolonged adjustment period. Cunningham checks every one of those boxes. She is experienced. She is physically capable. She shoots the ball from distance at a level that translates immediately to any offensive system. She brings an intensity to her defensive engagement that first-year franchises desperately need because young rosters without that competitive edge get exposed early in ways that are damaging to organizational culture before it has fully formed. From Golden State's perspective, if Cunningham is available, she is not a consolation prize. She is a target. That reality is what makes Indiana's decision so genuinely consequential rather than merely procedurally uncomfortable. They are not choosing between protecting Cunningham and leaving an anonymous role player exposed. They are choosing between protecting Cunningham and accepting the probability that a direct competitor acquires her, integrates her immediately, and deploys her against Indiana in games that matter. There is an additional layer underneath even that calculation that the front office cannot ignore. Clark knows what Cunningham means to her experience on this team. She has expressed it, not in dramatic public declarations, but in the quieter, more credible language of consistent acknowledgement that players use when they want to communicate something real without manufacturing a headline. The way she talks about Cunningham in interviews carries a specificity that generic teammate appreciation doesn't. It reads like someone describing a relationship that has genuine weight. Front offices that ignore those signals from their cornerstone players don't remain in the business of building around cornerstone players for long. Indiana's leadership is aware of that dynamic. It is almost certainly a factor in how they are approaching this decision. Whether awareness translates into a protection slot is the question the entire Indiana fan base is currently waiting to have answered. And the answer is coming faster than most of them realize. There is a broader conversation sitting underneath both of these stories that almost nobody is having directly, and it is arguably more important than either the NBC panel or the expansion draft math on its own. What is the WNBA actually becoming right now, in real time, and does the infrastructure surrounding it understand the speed at which that transformation is occurring? That question sounds abstract until you anchor it to specific, concrete developments. Then it stops being abstract entirely. 12 months ago, the idea of a WNBA player occupying a seat on NBC's premier basketball broadcast alongside 3 NBA Hall of Famers would have registered as aspirational thinking at best. Not because the talent didn't exist within the league to justify that kind of visibility, but because the institutional pipeline connecting women's basketball to national primetime sports media hadn't been built to that specification. The audience overlap wasn't there yet. The network incentive structure hadn't shifted sufficiently to make that seat feel like a sound business decision rather than a symbolic gesture. Clark didn't just walk through a door that was already open. She walked through a door and then turned around and made it significantly wider for everyone behind her. The NBC appearance is evidence of a structural shift, not a one-time exception. Networks don't make one-off decisions about primetime panel composition. They make decisions that reflect where they believe audience attention is moving, and then they build programming architecture around those beliefs. NBC putting Clark in that seat isn't a standalone moment. It's a signal about how they intend to position themselves relative to women's basketball going forward. That signal has financial implications for the entire league. It has negotiating implications for broadcast rights conversations that are already in motion. It has recruiting implications for the college players currently deciding whether the WNBA represents a viable professional destination worth building their athletic lives around. One player, one broadcast seat. Ripple effects that extend years in every direction. But here is where the infrastructure question becomes genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. The WNBA is expanding at a moment when its existing franchises are still working through fundamental questions about roster construction, player compensation, and organizational stability that more mature leagues resolved decades ago. The Golden State expansion isn't happening into a perfectly functioning ecosystem. It's happening into a league that is simultaneously experiencing historic growth in visibility and revenue while still navigating structural limitations that affect every team's ability to retain the players they develop. Indiana built something real around Clark in year 2. They built physical protection, competitive depth, and a locker room culture that gave their franchise player the environment she needed to take the next step in her professional development. The expansion draft now requires them to potentially dismantle a portion of what they built, not because they made poor decisions but because the system's mechanics don't contain an exemption for organizational continuity. That tension between a league that is growing faster than its structural framework was designed to accommodate is the real story sitting underneath the Cunningham situation. The expansion draft rules weren't written with this specific moment in mind. They were written for a league operating at a different scale of cultural and commercial relevance than the one that currently exists. The people running the WNBA are aware of this. The conversations happening at the league office level about how to manage growth without destabilizing the competitive environments that are generating that growth in the first place are real and they are urgent. How those conversations resolve will determine whether this current moment of expansion becomes a genuine foundation for sustained league health or a disruptive event that costs several franchises years of developmental progress. Indiana is not the only team navigating this tension. They are simply the most visible example of it right now because they are the franchise with the highest profile asset and the most emotionally invested national audience watching every personnel decision through a microscope. Every choice the Fever make carries weight that other franchises' choices simply do not carry at the same magnitude. That is the reality of being the organization that drafted Caitlin Clark. The visibility that comes with her presence extends to everything surrounding her, including the unglamorous administrative mathematics of an expansion draft that most casual fans had never thought about before this week. The fan base didn't sign up to become experts in WNBA roster protection mechanics. They signed up to watch their player compete and win. The front office's job is to make both things possible simultaneously. Whether they can thread that needle without losing Cunningham in the process is the question Indiana cannot yet answer publicly, even if they have already answered it privately. Step back from the roster math for a moment. Step back from the broadcast analysis. Step back from the expansion draft mechanics and the protection slot calculations and the network incentive structures. And ask the question that actually sits at the center of everything happening around Caitlin Clark right now. What does it look like when a sport is in the middle of being permanently changed by a single person? Not improved incrementally. Not nudged upward along a gradual trajectory that analysts can point to and say the growth was already coming and she merely accelerated it. Actually, fundamentally, structurally changed in ways that will still be visible and measurable 20 years from now when the players currently in college are approaching the end of their professional careers. Because that is what is happening. And the difficulty with recognizing it in real time is that transformation at that scale rarely announces itself clearly while it's occurring. It becomes obvious in retrospect. The people living inside it tend to underestimate its magnitude because they are too close to the daily details to perceive the full shape of what is shifting around them. The NBC panel moment is a data point. The expansion draft tension is a data point. The attendance numbers are a data point. The television ratings trajectory is a data point. The sponsorship movement is a data point. The conversation Clark is generating in spaces that have historically had no relationship with women's basketball is a data point. Taken individually, each of those things is interesting. Taken together, they describe something that the sports media landscape has not fully reckoned with yet because reckoning with it requires acknowledging a level of individual impact that challenges comfortable assumptions about how sports audiences work and what they respond to. Audiences are not supposed to follow players across league boundaries this seamlessly. The conventional framework for understanding sports viewership treats league loyalty as the primary organizing principle. People watch the NBA because they follow the NBA. People watch the WNBA because they follow the WNBA. The audiences are adjacent but largely separate, and the mechanisms for moving attention from one to the other are slow and structurally dependent on sustained marketing investment over time. Clark is not operating within that framework. She is operating outside it entirely. The people who discovered women's basketball through her college career did not arrive as NBA fans looking for an extension of their existing viewing habits. They arrived as Clark fans. Their primary loyalty is not institutional. It is personal. And personal loyalty travels in ways that institutional loyalty does not. It follows the subject across platforms, across broadcast environments, across contexts that the subject's original home institution didn't create and cannot fully control. That is why the NBC appearance landed the way it did. It wasn't a crossover in the traditional sports media sense. It was an audience that already existed. An audience built around a specific person rather than a specific league, encountering their subject in a new environment and responding with the same intensity they bring to every environment where she appears. NBC's producers understood that dynamic before they made the call. They understood that Clark's audience doesn't require a WNBA context to activate. It requires Clark. Put her in the frame, give her a legitimate platform, let her demonstrate the basketball intelligence that anyone who has watched her play already knows is there, and the audience engagement follows as a direct and predictable consequence. That understanding is what separated this appearance from a symbolic gesture and made it a genuine broadcast strategy. For Clark personally, the implications of that dynamic extend well beyond any single television appearance. She is building something that exists independently of any single institutional context. Her relevance is not contingent on the WNBA's growth trajectory, though she is simultaneously the primary engine of that trajectory. Her visibility is not bounded by what the league's existing infrastructure was designed to accommodate. She is, in the most literal professional sense, becoming larger than the container she currently occupies. That is not a criticism of the WNBA. It is an observation about the specific and unusual nature of what Clark represents as a sports figure at this particular moment. The league is growing in part because of her. And she is simultaneously growing in ways that extend beyond the league's current boundaries. Managing that dynamic for the league, for the Fever, and for Clark herself, is one of the most genuinely interesting organizational challenges in American professional sports right now. Indiana's front office is not just making expansion draft decisions. They are making decisions about how to hold on to the center of gravity of their entire franchise at a moment when that center of gravity is developing mass that no single franchise can fully contain. The Cunningham situation is painful. The NBC moment is historic. Both of them are symptoms of the same underlying reality. Everything around Caitlin Clark is being stress-tested by her own gravity. Let's talk about what Sophie Cunningham actually built in Indiana. Not the highlight version. The real version. Because the real version is more interesting than the highlights and considerably more relevant to understanding why this expansion draft decision carries emotional weight that exceeds anything the statistics can explain. When Cunningham arrived in Indiana ahead of the 2024 season, she was not arriving as a cornerstone acquisition. She was not the headline of a press release designed to signal organizational ambition. She was a veteran role player with a defined skill set, a known competitive temperament, and a professional history that told a clear story about what she was and what she wasn't. What she was: a shooter with legitimate range, a defender with physical willingness, and a competitor whose intensity level operated consistently at a register that most players only reach in elimination games. What she wasn't: a primary scorer, a creation threat off the dribble, or a player whose individual statistical profile was going to generate national headlines independent of the context surrounding her. Indiana signed her for what she was. They got considerably more than they anticipated from what she wasn't. The dynamic that developed between Cunningham and Clark over the course of that season was not manufactured by a marketing department. It was not the product of a coordinated media strategy designed to give Clark a narrative companion that would generate content. It emerged organically from the specific pressures of that specific season, pressures that were unusual in their intensity and public in ways that created a visibility around the internal team dynamic that most locker room relationships never experience. Clark was absorbing contact. That is the documented, filmed, repeatedly analyzed reality of her first professional season. The physicality directed at her, some of it within the bounds of competitive basketball and some of it operating in territory that generated legitimate debate about whether the officiating response was calibrated appropriately, was a consistent feature of her rookie year rather than an occasional occurrence. Most of her teammates responded within the normal parameters of professional basketball behavior. Verbal acknowledgement. Sideline support. The standard repertoire of teammate solidarity that every roster provides to every player in difficult moments. Cunningham responded differently. She responded with her body and with her voice and with a visible willingness to accept personal consequences for inserting herself into situations that were not directly her responsibility to manage. She communicated, in the language that competitive athletes understand more viscerally than any other, that the person standing next to her was not navigating this alone. That communication landed. It landed with Clark. It landed with the fan base watching it happen. And it landed with the rest of the league, which is the part of this story that matters most from a competitive standpoint. Professional athletes are exceptional readers of environment. They understand immediately and intuitively which teammates will hold the line when the game gets physical and which ones will recalibrate their positioning when the cost of engagement rises. That knowledge circulates through a league's competitive community faster than any scouting report. It shapes how opponents approach the players being protected. When Cunningham established herself as Clark's enforcer, she wasn't just providing emotional support to a teammate. She was altering the environmental calculation for every player in the league, considering how aggressively to test Clark's boundaries. She was raising the cost of that test in terms that professional athletes measure instinctively. That is not a small contribution. In a league where Clark's ability to function at her ceiling depends partly on whether she can operate without absorbing punishment that compounds across a long season, Cunningham's presence was directly load-bearing for Indiana's competitive viability. The fan base understood this intuitively before they could have articulated it analytically. Their adoption of Cunningham wasn't simply affection for a player who played hard. It was recognition of a specific functional role that she occupied with a completeness and a willingness that felt rare and valuable. They were not wrong. It was rare. And it was valuable. Which is exactly why the expansion draft math is so genuinely painful to confront honestly. Because Indiana isn't potentially losing a peripheral roster piece. They are potentially losing the player who defined the protective architecture around the most important person in their franchise. And the player who might be taking her place in that architecture, whoever Indiana identifies as Cunningham's functional successor, will be inheriting a role that was built through specific chemistry, specific history, and a specific demonstrated willingness that cannot be transferred through a transaction. You can replace the roster spot. You cannot replace what filled it. Indiana's front office knows this. Which means the decision they are currently making is not about whether they understand what they are risking. It's about whether they believe they have a choice. Here is the part of this story that requires the most intellectual honesty to tell correctly, because it cuts against the emotional current that has been running through the Indiana fan base's reaction to this situation. The Fever might be making the right decision. Sit with that for a moment before reacting to it, because the reasoning behind it is more substantive than the headline suggests and more relevant to Indiana's long-term competitive health than the short-term emotional accounting most of the commentary has been doing. Professional sports franchises are not built to optimize for sentiment. They are built to optimize for winning, and winning over a sustained period requires a specific kind of organizational discipline that occasionally demands decisions that feel wrong in the immediate moment but prove correct across a longer timeline. The franchises that have demonstrated the most sustained competitive success across professional sports history share a common characteristic that is almost never celebrated publicly because it generates exactly the kind of painful headlines Indiana is generating right now. They make unsentimental decisions about players they genuinely value when the structural mathematics of roster construction require it. This is not a comfortable truth. It is, however, a documented one. The argument for leaving Cunningham unprotected, made honestly and completely rather than as a dismissal of everything she provided, runs as follows. Indiana is entering a phase of organizational development where the composition of their roster needs to evolve beyond the specific defensive and competitive needs of Clark's first 2 professional seasons. The protective architecture Cunningham provided was essential during an adjustment period when Clark was learning the physical language of professional basketball and the league was simultaneously learning how to treat her. That adjustment period is not over, but it has progressed. Clark is not the same player she was in the first weeks of her rookie season. She is more physically prepared for professional contact, more strategically aware of how to protect herself within the flow of the game, and more established within the league's competitive community in ways that organically reduce the specific vulnerability that made Cunningham's enforcement role so critical in year 1. The roster space and protection slot that Cunningham occupies could be allocated to a player whose skill set addresses a different dimension of Indiana's competitive needs going forward. A player who provides offensive creation from a position of greater individual statistical production. A player whose presence expands the tactical options available to Indiana's coaching staff in ways that open up the floor for Clark rather than primarily deterring physical aggression against her. That is a legitimate organizational argument. It does not require anyone to pretend that Cunningham's contributions weren't real or weren't valuable. It simply requires acknowledging that roster construction is an ongoing process of matching personnel to evolving competitive requirements, and that what a team needed at one stage of its development is not automatically what it needs at the next stage. The counter-argument, made with equal honesty, is that the specific thing Cunningham provides cannot actually be replaced by upgrading a statistical category. Protection of a franchise player is not a basketball skill in the traditional sense. It is a relational and psychological function that operates at a level below the box score. The player who inherits that role from Cunningham will not inherit the credibility that comes from having demonstrated it publicly under the specific pressures of Clark's first 2 seasons. They will be establishing that credibility from scratch, in front of an audience that already knows what it looks like when the role is filled by someone who does it instinctively rather than instrumentally. That credibility gap has a cost. It may not be a cost that shows up in the standings immediately, but it shows up in the environment. And environment affects performance in ways that are real even when they resist precise quantification. Indiana's front office is weighing both sides of that argument right now. They are not doing it carelessly or without awareness of the stakes. They are doing it with the full knowledge that whichever direction they move, a significant portion of their fan base is going to experience the decision as either a betrayal or a validation, and that neither of those emotional responses fully captures the complexity of what they are actually navigating. The fans who are furious at the possibility of losing Cunningham are not wrong to feel what they feel. What she built in Indiana is real, and the prospect of losing it is legitimately painful. The front office that may ultimately decide they cannot afford to protect her is not wrong to make that calculation either. They are managing a roster inside a system with real constraints, trying to build something sustainable around a player whose trajectory is moving faster than any organizational framework was designed to accommodate. Both things are true simultaneously. The expansion draft does not care about the emotional complexity of that reality. It has a deadline. And that deadline is approaching.